My name is Leander KRAIGER. I am a student here at the Diplomatic Academy, and I'm very happy to moderate this first panel on the topic of women in modern politics. Now, if you have listened to the opening remarks, it will be very clear that in the last years, progress has been made in gender equality. Despite that, women remain dramatically underrepresented in politics, and they are confronted with deeply ingrained stereotypes questioning their abilities. In other words, the stigma against women is still alive, and 2021 sees prolonged marginalization of women in political and public life. Now, today we will discuss this subject matter with our four distinguished guests that I would like to introduce now in order of their presentations. First off, we have Dr. Melanie SULLY. She's a professor for political science and the head of the Governance Institute, which is based here in Vienna, and among many things, they deal with the culture of governance, political participation, representation, gender, and youth. Then I would like to also welcome Magistra Laura WIMMER. She's the deputy head of the Department for Women's Affairs in the city of Vienna. Then we have Dr. Birgit SAUER. She's a professor of political science at the University of Vienna. And then last but certainly not least, we have the Austrian ambassador to Brazil, Dr. Irene GINER-REICHL. Now, just one last formality before we start with the presentations. At the end of the presentations, we will have about 15 minutes time for discussion and questions. If you do have any questions, please feel free to use the chat function on Zoom or comment on our Facebook live stream. There are two options here. You can either just write the question down or also indicate with your question that you would like to pose it yourself, in which case I will then call your name so you can pose the question in person. Now, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Melanie SULLY, who will start with her presentation. She also has a PowerPoint slide, which should come up any moment by my colleagues. And then once the PowerPoint is up and running, Dr. SULLY, you are more than welcome to start the panel.
Okay. Well, thank you very much also to the Diplomatic Academy for the invitation, and also to the sponsors, the City of Vienna and the Canadian Embassy. And to kick off with, I would say I am a feminist in the sense of Pierre Trudeau, who in 2015, when asked if he was a feminist, said, yeah, of course, and he was proud to, and why he had so many women in his cabinet, in his government, said, well, because it's 2015. Well, here we are with 2021, and we've still got the same problem, basically. So that to start off. Next slide, please. Underrepresentation. Well, you can get all the statistics you need to prove this from the gender website, which is linked to the European Commission. And the latest are on the last quarter, 2020. The Scandinavian countries on the whole do much better, and countries like Hungary have a very few percentage of representation in parliaments. We have Denmark and Germany with female heads of government currently in the EU. Otherwise, not so much presence. And when you look at senior ministers in the EU, then again, it's the Scandinavian countries that come out with a better representation in this respect. Next slide, please. As I said, because it's 2021, why should we be talking about this? Why do we want to correct this underrepresentation? Well, there are international commitments that EU countries have, that Austria has signed up to as well within the OSCE to reach a minimum of 30% or 40% as the Council of Europe. Now, this increases visibility of women. The argument being the more women you have in politics, then the less it becomes something to talk about or unusual. The acceptance will increase. Political parties will realize it's in their interest. And then once you get beyond this percentage, it tends to be something that you will not go back on. Otherwise, you're working on it all the time, and there can be setbacks. Political parties are really the key to the whole thing in politics. They're the gatekeepers. They can choose the candidate list. So without getting on the candidate list, you don't get into parliament, and then you have a less chance of getting into a high position. Also, the Austrian Federal Constitution has an equality clause. So there's all these reasons, we need to do something about this. Next slide, please. Quotas. This comes up all the time. For some countries, I think we have to accept that it's a negative thing. They see it as undemocratic because of the communist past. Other countries, you've got France, it's embedded in the constitution. There's been a lot of work done by the OSCE and ODIHR in Warsaw, based in Warsaw, on this question. Quotas, yes, but they need sanctions to work it. First, I'll go on to more on this. Next slide, please. So sanctions can involve financial penalties if parties fail to put up a gender parity list. But in France, we've seen that on the whole, the wealthier parties just pay the fine. So you're not achieved too much on that sense. There can be positive incentives like KRAIGER, where the parties get more money, not less money, if they have a certain percentage of women on the list. Or as in Slovenia and some other countries, the election officials can reject a party list in a certain district if it is not up to a certain percentage. This is important because in Slovenia it did happen. And as a result, one party could not put up its candidates in all the districts and therefore didn't qualify for television time, which is obviously all important in getting your candidates elected. So this was really quite a big penalty. Next slide, please. Obviously, in a system like the UK, the election system is not proportional. So the quotas are not quite so applicable, but you can do mentoring. You can use money that you get for the party to train women for a political career. And that will favor the underrepresented gender. I think that's important to stress that, because if it was the other way around and we had fewer men in politics or in an electoral district, then that would be something which would work in their favor as well. So it's not just all about, getting more women. That's because they're underrepresented. And if it was something else, then that would be a need to correct as well. Now, quotas are okay, but you need to also be aware of the ranking on the party list in that electoral system with proportional representation. Otherwise, a party could say, you know what, we've got 50% women on our party list. And when you look at it, you find they're all at the bottom, have absolutely no hope of getting elected. So you have to have some kind of ranking to ensure that they are on positions where they can actually be elected. Next slide, please. Now, quotas can be legislative quotas in the electoral laws. There's Belgium, Spain, Greece, etc. In Ireland, there are electoral laws. There can be in the constitution, as I mentioned, with France, or the political parties can get their own quotas and be disciplined enough to try to meet that. As I said, there's a link there for more information from the work done by the OSCE and ODIHR, with whom I actually was privileged enough to work. Next slide, please. So we're talking about quantity. So you can have more women in parliament, but what do they do there? Do they have more power? Can they influence decision making, or are they just so that parties and parliament say, you know what, we got lots of women in our parliament? So where does power lie? The committees are the arena where a lot of the parliamentary work is done. And when you look at that, you find a lot of the chairpersons could be males. Representation in debates, how often do women speak in parliamentary debates? Who decides who they choose to actually talk in a debate? These kind of things are actually the minutiae beyond just looking at how many women are in parliament, etc. And then I think very important codes of conduct in parliament to ensure a respectful exchange of views, censure of sexism. And I think if I was asked, which question am I tired of answering, I wouldn't want to answer any more. And that is where women complain of intimidation, of sexist remarks by their male colleagues, very often in parliament. This has been something which is highlighted in recent times. And then to look at what ministries actually women get when they do get into government. The big offices of states, and these are the finance ministry, the interior ministry, the foreign ministry. These are very often the ministries where you find huge underrepresentation of women. And this is where power can be seen to be particularly important. And obviously you have to understand men aren't too keen on giving up power, because if a woman's in that job, then it means, it's one less man. It's pretty obvious. So that is the nature of power politics in effect. Next slide, please. What barriers do women have to overcome? Well, Mrs. Thatcher found very hard at first to get into politics, to get a constituency. She was always asked, how are you going to combine that? You've got young children, so the family. If you don't have a network behind you, it's going to be very difficult. Financing, if you're in a system where there are primaries, you need to finance that, and women earn less. It's going to be more difficult. Time. Many women have to not just look after children, but also, particularly during the pandemic, elderly in the family. The Four-Set Society in the UK has done a lot of research on this. They call it the 4 Cs. There's culture, childcare, cash, and confidence. And these are the main barriers that women have to overcome in politics. Next slide, please. The media. Greater visibility means women will be seen as accepted and even as an asset by parties to winning an election. And if they don't have enough women, they might even be, censured by the voters. This is the case in Denmark. Some organizations and males refuse to take part in all male panels and discussions. I think that can be something which is a point. All male photos in the media can also be open to criticism, but still are very common. All male press conferences aroused little criticism. During the pandemic, we've seen this again and again. And that does exclude an identity by many in the population. Next slide, please. Representation. You could say, okay, so do we have to have a parliament where all sections of the population are specially represented? Well, women make up over 50% of the population, are hugely underrepresented. And like I said, if it was the other way around, we could be talking about male underrepresentation. But also, we need diversity. We need more young people in politics. We need more ethnic, from ethnic backgrounds, migration background. This would make a much a parliament in which people could say they're not just on another planet. At the moment, a parliament is very much criticized for being completely out of touch. Next slide, please. If you want more information on mayors in Austria, the Gemeindebund, and this link will take you right there. They've got all the statistics on every town in Austria. Over 2,000 mayors in Austria. It's amazing, for a small country. Anyway, next slide, please. The dark red bits are where there are female mayors. You got to look perhaps hard. It's better than it used to be, but shows a huge underrepresentation here. Next slide, please. Why? Well, actually, sometimes towns will say they don't have so many candidates, female candidates. They don't want to do the job. time, it's a thankless task. In a small community, the political culture could be very anathema to women doing this kind of job. Next slide, please. What is to be done? What should we do? Well, we should support each other, work with males, not alienate them. You know, there's a lot of they're very sympathetic. Not complain it's unfair, because politics is, you know, that word doesn't exist. It's about power. And try some subtle fight back. I'm reminded of an example that comes from the women in the White House way back, when they I got the impression that when a man had a great idea, everybody said, you know, yes, that's a fantastic idea. And when a woman come up with a great idea, then it was taken up by a man who then was, you know, applauded. So the women did the same thing. When the man had a great idea, they just ignored it. And then they repeated it and supported each other. So you can do all kinds of things. Parliamentary networks, gender budgeting, the impact of legislation on gender, which has been very important during the pandemic, not able to have been done because a lot of legislation has been passed fast necessarily, but not taken account of the impact. So there's not been a lot of impact assessment. Well, that was it. And I'd be glad to answer your questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sully. We will do the questions in the end. Now we would ask Mrs. Wimmer to start her presentation, and there's also a PowerPoint coming up for that.
Yeah, very warm welcome from my side, and thank you so much for the organization and for this very interesting panel. I'm very honored to be on. Yeah, let me give you a few details about women in politics in Vienna concerning the city administration and beyond, and some of our project as Department for Women's Affairs. Next slide, please. Just a quick introduction words. We are a municipal department for women's affairs, and we exist since the early 90s as part of the city administration. Our target groups are all girls and women living in Vienna, and our strategic objectives from empowering women and girls, combating gender-specific violence and stereotypes, and of course the important topics of equal opportunities and equal pay. One of our main work is also to secure funding for women-oriented projects and organizations. Next slide, please. There is a vast network of gender equality within the city administration, headed by the Deputy Mayor and Executive City Councillor for Women and Housing, Katrin Gahl. We have a Gender Equality Commissioner, a Head of Division for Gender Mainstreaming, Ursula Bauer, which will be talking later today about COVID-19 and the crisis. We have a division for gender budgeting and, of course, also the program for women's health, as well as an expert for city planning, gender-sensitive city planning. Next slide, please. Some facts and figures about women in politics in Vienna, and later on about women in management and leadership, as was already talked in the introduction panel by Dr. Irene Pochtler. From our population, from approximately 1.9 million, we have over 50% women. In the Vienna City Council, 42 members are women, and one of the two deputy mayors is a woman. In the city government, we have 42.8 executive city councillors. And concerning the district heads, that's the structure we have in Vienna, with only 7 of 23 women, we still have a way to go. And as was already said by Dr. SULLY, it's the different parties represented in the city council, which have the different women's quotas and regulations within their parties. And therefore, that also explains the different numbers in the city council. Next slide, please. As you can see on this graphic, it's very depending on the parties. Next slide, please. Women in management and leadership, just to talk about quota and the legislative within the city administration. Among the department heads within the city, we have approximately 38% of women. This is a number increasing, and it's based on quota regulations. The legislative foundation is the Law on Equal Treatment, which states that women are to be promoted if they are underrepresented in what we call occupational field. And by underrepresented, we mean the 50%, because lots of the quota regulations start with the 40, but in this extent, it was changed to the 50. And the so-called Equality Commissioner within the city and her team are responsible for the compliance with this legislation. In companies affiliated with the city, Vienna has committed itself a few years ago to a quota of women in the supervisory board positions of 40%. And there is also a self-commitment on the national levels for company with federal participation. Next slide, please. This is like this numbers and facts and figures not about Vienna, but on an Austrian level. And I think it was already said also this morning about the very low numbers from women in governing bodies. In companies with a quota obligation, the share of women in supervisory boards is now 31.7%. And this shows the effectiveness from the women's quota installed in 2018 concerning those companies, because they started at 22%. And the legislative foundation is the Law on Equal Treatment of Women and Men in Supervisory Boards, with the 30% but only for companies listed at large and publicly listed. The sanction is if the position is not, if it's not fulfilled, the quota, the position stays vacant, which has not been the case yet as far as I have the overview. We see the sanctions in other European countries as well. And I can only recommend from the Arbeiterkammer, the management report, which states every year the numbers of quotas the numbers of women in supervisory boards. In management boards, there is a very much significant underrepresentation. It's only 6.8% women in companies listed on the Viennese Stock Exchange. Next slide, please. Now I might just talk a few minutes about two projects of ours as Women's Department concerning representation and the broad meaning of participation of women. Seeing that the participation of women is very much needed for equal gender equality beyond the political representation. One is our Vienna Equality Monitoring Report, which was developed to measure and analyze the status quo of equality of men and women, and has, of course, a focus on representation of women and also on participation of women. In 12 topic areas and over 100 indicators, we have provided the empirical basis to state the status quo of gender equality, and also to see the development. It's a periodic monitoring, and the newest monitoring is work in progress right now. The innovative thing I want to mention is that we didn't start with the empirical data and then formulate equality goals. But the first step when we created the monitoring was to actually define our equality goals. By us, I mean it was us as a department with specialist departments, with experts, and as well the political representatives. And from the defined equality goals, then we looked for the indicators and the data, which means that in the monitoring, there is also a lack of data. You can see the fields where there has not been gender sensitive data, so that we can also close this gap. Next slide, please. Yeah, what I just said, it's like the broader aspect of participation of women in general, which is necessary in our, also because also to ensure that the needs of all groups of societies, meaning in this case women, are respected. We see that, for example, very much in city planning participation processes, where it's very important that women are equally represented, that they participate, and that they also state the different needs. And right now we have a focus on the field of persons with disability, and we see that very much there in the advocacy groups as well, that it's important that women are equally represented and participate. Next slide, please. And last but not least, I hope I'm still in the time. I want to take the time to talk a few minutes about the field of digitalization, to show how important the whole topic of women's participation is. We have quite a focus on this topic right now in the city of Vienna in general, and especially as Women's Department. Digitalization is an important field of the future, and we see that gender equality has to be ensured in this process and beyond the question of IT jobs. It's not only the question how many women and girls study IT, how are they represented in the jobs, but it's also a question how they participate in the whole process of development, how do they participate in the formation of the topic of digitalization. And we just did a recent study called Women Digitalization Contribution Potential, where we had a focus on the areas of education, labor market, the digital space and communication, and gender stereotypes. Next slide, please. This is just a very short overview of what we found out, but to be said, the study is soon to be presented in all its detail, and I'm very happy to share the link afterwards when we have it online and with anybody who is interested. And like just on this short slide, it was realized that there are 4 different types of active digital contribution potentials among women, meaning these different types. How do women participate? What is their labor market training? Do they work in the IT field? What equipment do they have? Next slide, please. Yeah, and here I'm at the end of my quick input. In Vienna, the number of women in politics is increasing, and we see that the quota is working, but it's a question of the necessity of sanctions, because if you have the quota based on, if you don't have sanctions, it's not going to work like it does with the sanctions. The women's representation and participation in the broad field matter for gender equality. Only then the needs can be addressed, but I want to state that it's not a guarantee. And especially, as it was talked already many times this morning, since the COVID-19 crisis, addressing the issues of women in multilateral fields is more important than ever, and also the participation and representation, because not only then the issues can be addressed. Thank you very much for your attention and time, and I'm happy to be ready for questions afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Wimmer, on this overview about the situation of women in politics in Vienna. Now, next up, we have Dr. Birgit SAUER. Dr. SAUER, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation, and hello to everybody, and thanks to the 2 speakers, who already made, I think, gave a lot of input. So maybe I can wrap up a little bit or dive deeper into some issues. I think what we have seen is that underrepresentation of women is a general feature of modern liberal democracies, and women are underrepresented in decision-making bodies, in parliaments, but also in governments and in the administration. But of course, the underrepresentation varies according to national context. And if we look at Austria, I think Austria is an interesting example, although a small country, but we can see a progress in the representation of women in the national parliament, in the Nationalrat. Today it's about around 40%, but there has been really a boost since the 1970s. Until then, women made only 6 to 7 or 9%. But the low numbers of women in parliament is mainly due to the right-wing Freedom Party, because the Freedom Party has a rather low share of women in parliament, while the Greens now have about 57 or 58% women in their caucus. But as we know, after World War II, the country only had one female chancellor, Birgit Bierlein, and she wasn't elected by parliament, but she was appointed after the Ibiza crisis. And Austria didn't have any women president by now. So if we look historically, the underrepresentation of women has a long history. Since the 19th century, when we could say, so the field of modern states and modern politics developed, this sphere of politics developed as a male or as a masculinist sphere, and women since the 19th century have been excluded from politics. Women were denied the right to vote in most of the countries. And so politics developed as a sort of male profession. And this changed in Austria only after World War I, in the first Austrian Republic, when women gained the right to vote. And then we had a break in Austria during National Socialism. And then in the Second Republic, after World War II, when women were given the right again to vote and to be elected, we can see that there has been a long restorative stage where women couldn't enter politics. Only some parties gave women the opportunity to enter politics. But until the 1970s in Austria, politics was a male profession. And then the second women movement claimed for the participation of women, for a better representation of women. And then the parties, and Dr. Sully already said that parties are the gatekeepers in so-called party democracies. And then the parties in the late 1970s decided to implement quota. And this was a time when the party landscape changed, and then suddenly parties saw that they need women voters. And then they somehow tried to attract women voters and decided to do this by women representatives. So quotas were implemented by Austrian parties, and these are so-called voluntary party quotas because there are no legislative quota, but parties decide to introduce quota on the voluntarily basis. And this is, of course, the Green Party, the Social Democrats, and the ÖVP. So they have quota regulations with different quota targets from 50% with the Greens to around 30, and that now 40% of the ÖVP. However, what we could see in Austria, and this is also in other countries, also in countries which have legislative quotas, we can see what we call a post-quota gender gap, meaning that for the Belgian case, you have a 50% binding legislative quota, but there are no 50% women in parliament. So the same is true for Austria. The Social Democrats for a long time had a 40% gender quota, but in their parliamentary caucus, there were never 40% women. So the number was rather below. So research showed that this post-quota gender gap has to be explained by how electoral lists are composed. And also Dr. Sully said that there are a lot of tricks to cheat about the electoral lists and then to not zip the electoral lists, but to put women at the bottom of the electoral lists. But even if you have now regulations for ranking and zipping lists, you can see that the electoral laws also impact on how the quota regulations are implemented. And there we can see for the Austrian parties that somehow parties can circumvent the full implementation of their quota regulations. Yeah, and I can go deeper into this in the Q&A section. But what we can see is that only since the election of 2017, the quota parties, the 3 quota parties in Austria, now reach their quota stipulation. So this is rather late, thinking that they introduced the parties in the quota system in the 1980s. So for more than 40 years or 35 years, the parties somehow circumvented their quota regulations. So another question we were asked, why should we care about women in parliaments? And there we could see that research shows that there is no automatic relation between the descriptive or quantitative representation of women and the acting for women, saying, no, there is no guaranteed more women-friendly outcome if there are more women in parliament. So there is no clear correlation. And as it has been discussed also a little bit in the panel before, there needs an explicit acting for a women-friendly politics. So there needs a feminist intervention that these quantitative representation then also entails a more qualitative women-friendly interpretation. And of course, this acting for women could also be done by women, by men. There is no need that only women act in a women-friendly way and push forward women-friendly policies. So, but why then care about quota? Is this still a goal that we should go for? And I think yes, and I think I only want to make 2 arguments. And the first argument is an argument of justice. I think women should be given the same right as men to do politics as a profession. So it's just a simple justice argument. And the second argument is an argument which has been made for a long time within the gender debate in political science, and it was promoted by a British political scientist, Anne Phillips, and she calls her concept politics of presence. And she says that women have to be present in parliament because due to their different experiences, due to different socializations, it's important that the views and the voices of women are present in parliament. And of course, this is true for all other marginalized groups in modern politics. This is true for younger people. This is true for people with a, for instance, working class background. This is true for people with a migration background. So I think a more diverse parliaments is a question of justice, but it's also a question of how diverse policy outcomes and policy outputs could be. So I think we need gender quotas, but we should also think about a more intersectionality or diversity in parliament. So I think I'll stop here so that also the last speaker has a chance to develop her ideas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. SAUER. And now we will have Ambassador GINER-REICHL with the last presentation. She also has prepared a PowerPoint, which should come up any moment now. And then Ambassador, you're good to go.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank you very much for inviting me and congratulate you on this fine conference. It's really very heartwarming to see the effort and how the effort resulted in such a good program and such interesting presentations so far. I will try to develop the topic that was so well introduced by previous speakers by taking it to a more specific area. I asked myself the question, well, if we talk about women in politics, why should we care? And are there any areas where we can demonstrate easily in 10 minutes why it is good for society to have a more equal participation of women in politics? And next slide, please. I thought an area where I could demonstrate that quite nicely is the area that will be high on the political agenda in all countries practically, and that is how are we going to reconstruct, how are we going to reinvigorate our economies in the post-COVID-19 period, and how are we going to deal with climate change, because climate change is still going to be around even once the virus has been hopefully combated by vaccines and preventive measures and all kinds of other conducive policies. So my main argument is that we can deal with those two questions by combining them. We can look at economic stimulus and climate policy together. And as we do that, we see very clearly how the underrepresentation of women in those fields, in the fields of politics in general, but also more specifically in the fields of energy and climate change, diminish the potential that we have for innovation. And innovation and creativity is something that we need very, very urgently. Next slide, please. I have a couple of slides with big figures that just show how differently women were impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic to men. Not saying that men were not impacted, of course they were very much impacted, but given the differences in the treatment of men and women in our societies, there's also a significant difference in how the COVID-19 crisis impacted on women. We already spoke about the gender pay gap, which is very significant. This slide recalls that women make up a very high percentage of the informal economy in many countries. The informal economy was very, very badly hit by Corona. Next slide, please. We also have the imbalance in the unpaid care work that is taken up by women much more significantly than men. In the Corona crisis, this imbalance was further heightened. Next slide, please. This is just to put figures on what women actually do for the economy, even though it is not monetarized. So we don't really see it in the balance sheets of the gross national products. Next slide shows how women took a much higher toll on their health as front workers in the health system than men. Just a few slides to illustrate the case that women were very severely and more and differently impacted by Corona than men. If we now look to the second leg of my argumentation, the climate situation, please go to the next slide. we have the situation that as a result of the economic crisis, greenhouse gases were reduced in 2020 significantly. The estimates and the data so far show that it is between 6 and 8% of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, which should be a welcome thing, because we all know that we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions if we want to stabilize the global climate. But it is not a welcome phenomenon as it is, because it is it has to do with the recession, with the economic recession. It shows that the energy systems and the economic growth of the world is still not decoupled, which we want, of course. And it also shows that there are very, very significant, very bad effects on many countries, such as, for example, countries where we have large populations without access to electricity, where the situation worsened, is also the situation of the millions and millions of people who don't have access to clean cooking worsened further. And we have, according to first analysis, also a heightened risk for sovereign debt crisis in a number of developing countries as a result of the economic recession. So it is clear that we need structural change and not greenhouse gas emissions based on economic depressions, but true structural change, and structural change that can only come around through true energy transitions. Let's not forget that energy-related emissions make up 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. And when we think about what it takes to bring on the ground an energy transition, then we have to be aware of the fact that energy transitions are much more than just changing from a polluting fuel to a less polluting fuel, or to a renewable non-polluting fuel. It's a transformational process that goes very deep into society. It requires us to change patterns of consumption, distribution, investments, and so forth. It requires coalitions and capabilities of actors of the widest variety, new socio-technical regimes of policy, regulation, mindsets, beliefs, and social practices. So clearly, the energy transition requires behavioral change, innovation, and integration across sectors. And when we talk about such a major societal undertaking, it is clear that we need diverse backgrounds, capabilities, and perspectives, and as large a talent pool that we can get. Now, sadly, next slide, please. When we look at the representation of women in sustainable energy, we see that at best we are at 32%. That's a figure provided by the International Renewable Energy Agency. When we look at other statistics and other studies, there are no comparable data sets, really. The figures for women participation is even much lower. Now, we have a situation where jobs in sustainable energy currently are estimated at the global level at 11 million jobs. And we expect that to rise to 42 million in 2050. And obviously, the challenge must be that we come to a situation where there is a much more equal participation of women in sustainable energy. Next slide. Some recommendations that we have given, we meaning in this context, the Global Women's Network for the Energy Transition, which I co-founded 4 years ago with together with 3 other women, and of which I'm the pro bono president currently. Here are some of the recommendations that we can give to make sustainable energy more inclusive and more diverse, and therefore to provide for a talent pool that is as diverse as our society. So it's about participation of women and men in order to truly do justice to the many commitments that we have on the books that the previous speakers already mentioned. But it is also because we need to build this transformation by using all the available talent that we have, all the available life experience, innovation, creativity, etc. And in order for that to happen, we cannot leave 50% of the population out. The next slide is my last slide, and it gives a few recommendations specifically for including women better in the effort to build back better after Corona, also in the context of the climate change policies, which will be incorporated in many of these economic recovery projects. With that, I hope I've given a concrete example on why it is not just a question of justice and a question of living up to commitments that we have in our legal documents, in our human rights covenants, etc., but why it actually is good for society at large and provides better results if we include women alongside with men in the major policy tasks at hand in our days. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. We are already quite close to the end. There is time for a question, and there is a question from Leila Hasanbegovic. Leila, are you here to pose a question?
Yes, I'm here. So good afternoon. My question is for Professor SAUER. So you have mentioned that representation on the electoral list is no guarantee of equal participation of women voting in politics and the election campaign process. So basically this supports the fact that the existence of quota laws does not necessarily mean their effective implementation for the benefit of women themselves. So what is your opinion, how to effectively solve this major problem? And my second question, if we have time, is for Ms. GINER-REICHL. And that is, what are the steps that governments and businesses can take to mitigate the negative economic impacts of COVID-19 on women? Thank you.
Okay, so shall we start immediately? Yeah, okay, yeah, thanks, Leila, for this interesting question. You're absolutely right. The quota law doesn't help anything. So it's all about how quota laws or voluntarily party quotas, how they are implemented. And this is the important issue. And then, of course, through implementation, we can see how the quota regulation themselves need to be improved. And therefore, you can see for Austria, and here in Austria, it's a main problem that we have so small local districts. And in these local districts, only 1 or 2 people then can go to the federal parliament. And if you have on the first place of a list only men, then it's only men who go to the federal parliament. And even though if you have a zipped list, man, woman, man, woman, man, woman, if the parties have only 1 person to go, then it's a man. So you should then say, well, we have to compose lists that on the first 2 or 3 places of a list, we have to have women. Yeah, and then we can see that the number of women will rise. So, and this is of course different from country to country. In Belgium, you can see, well, Belgium has a legislative quota list, and they had first a quota law. And then they saw, well, there were a lot of flaws in the law, and the parties did circumvent the law. So then they improved the law I don't know, I think 3 or 4 years later, and then they recommended we have to have zipped lists, and we have to have women on first place, etc., etc. So I think it's now we are at the stage that we have experience with quota laws, and now the regulations have to be improved, and there need to be watchdog who look how the composition of electoral law electoral lists referred to electoral laws, because the electoral laws are really important for how the lists are working. So there is a little bit of way to go, but it's not impossible. It's doable. And of course, then, for instance, just to give a last example, Denmark is a country with a rather high representation of women in parliament, and the country does not have any quota regulation because the parties themselves somehow have established a culture that they put women on the list, and they know that their electorate wants to see women in parliament. And I think there is still a way to go for other countries. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. SAUER. Ambassador GINER-REICHL, you want to give an answer to the second?
Yes, thank you very much. I think the short answer is women need to be at the table when strategies about post-COVID recovery programs are discussed, and when energy transitions are planned. That's the first, the easiest and the shortest answer, because then they can draw attention to the various connections that exist. You know, there are connections between lockdown and violence against women. There are connections between lack of access to digital means of communication, which is not a problem in Austria, but is a problem in many developing countries, and the situations of lockdown and the discrimination, the systemic discrimination that women suffer in so many situations, you know, aggravates these difficulties. Healthcare, women's healthcare needs were significantly underserved as a result of the overtaxing of hospitals and health systems everywhere in connection with the corona pandemic. So the most important thing, I think, is to include women on an equal par with men in all these strategy discussions and decisions, and in the implementation and in the monitoring. And then the details can be worked out. They're obviously specific, and you cannot give a general answer.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. We are already at the end of our panel. Maybe I will go around once very briefly, and each of you could give maybe a closing comment to today's panel. Dr. SULLY, would you want to start?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that the key coming out of all of this is the political parties, because already mentioned the quotas depend on getting onto the candidate list in a way which will get you elected. And I think the connected problem is the electoral officials, the election officials, because they could control or look at the candidate list. But again, in Austria, for the most part, the election officials are appointed by the parties, you know, so you keep coming back to the same problem. And they're mostly men, if you look on that. So they wouldn't really have much interest in contradicting their own party. They are officially independent. Political parties, I think, are the key to everything. Unless they move in cooperation, I think things will just move at a very small snail pace.
Thank you, Magister Wimmer.
Yeah, I make it quite short to just summarize again that women's representation and participation matters because of lots of reasons. But I want to state what Dr. SAUER earlier said, that unfortunately it's not a guarantee for women-friendly policies, but actually it would be the work of all of us needed to do and to state women-friendly policies. So to address men and women with that.
Thank you, Dr. SAUER.
Yeah, thanks. I think as far as I'm right, there have been attempts on the Vienna level also to introduce legislative quota regulations. And I would say this is a way to go, because then all parties have to stick to quota regulations and they have to encourage women. And so the argument, well, there are not that many women, blah, blah, blah. We know this is an old argument. And in all the countries which have binding legislative quota laws, they find women. So it's an encouragement of women to go into parliament. So I would really appreciate if parties and if women within parties, and they struggle for quota in all parties, I know that we did interviews, I would really appreciate if the country of Austria could go forward towards legislative binding quota regulation. And I also would stress what Mrs. Ambassador said. It's really important to look at policy issues, and maybe the COVID crisis and the ongoing climate crisis is also an important, or opens a window of opportunity to give women more say in which direction we could go for a better future. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Now, for me, the issue of equality between women and men is very much also about future readiness of a society. I'm seeing very severe challenges for our societies, for our countries in the years to come. And I believe that we will need all the innovation, all the creativity, all the combined life experiences from the most diverse backgrounds that we can mobilize to navigate these challenges successfully. So to leave out the capacities of half the population in so many political processes and decision-making simply is a disservice to society at large. It's an injustice to women who are capable and hardworking and have demonstrated that. And it is a disservice to society at large, because we can then not draw on all the potential that we actually have at our disposal. And I think we will sorely need it.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers. Certainly the key takeaway is that in order to serve society at its best, we would need legalization, a legislative quota to ensure that we benefit from all the wisdom and intelligence that we have available. We are now really at the end of this panel. Thanks again to all of you